On a frigid, rain-soaked night in the heart of the city, the streets glistened under a relentless downpour, transforming the urban landscape into a shimmering maze of shadows and reflections. The air hung heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to seep into every corner, every crack of the pavement. Water cascaded in sheets, drumming against the asphalt with a steady, unforgiving rhythm that echoed the pulse of a metropolis teetering on the edge of something unknown. Inside his patrol car, Officer Ryan Granger sat motionless, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, fingers tracing the worn leather as if seeking some anchor in the storm. His boots, damp from an earlier patrol, pressed against the soggy mat beneath him, the faint squelch of water barely audible over the roar of rain pelting the roof. Through the streaked windshield, he watched droplets chase one another in chaotic rivulets, their frantic race mirroring the restless churn of his thoughts. Granger was a man shaped by years on the force, hardened, observant, and guided by an instinct he'd learned to trust above all else. Tonight, that instinct gnawed at him, a quiet but persistent whisper that something was amiss. The city, usually alive with the clamor of nightlife, felt eerily subdued. The upscale district, with its polished storefronts and glowing restaurant signs, lay hushed under the storm's weight. Only the Golden Palace, a haven for the city's wealthiest elite, stood defiant against the gloom, its amber lights spilling onto the wet sidewalk like a promise of sanctuary. Granger had parked his cruiser just a stone's throw from its entrance, the vantage point offering a clear view of the comings and goings. He wasn't sure why he'd chosen this spot. Tonight logic told him it was routine, but his gut argued otherwise. The air felt charged, heavy with anticipation, as if the storm itself were holding its breath. Then, through the blur of rain, a Rolls-Royce Phantom emerged like a specter from the darkness, its sleek, obsidian frame cut through the deluge with an almost supernatural grace, tires gliding over the slick pavement as if untouched by the chaos around it. Granger's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. The car was a masterpiece, set to pristine, too deliberate in its movements. When the driver's door swung open with a muted thud, a figure stepped out, and Granger's breath caught in his chest, even in the downpour. The man exuded an unshakable presence. His tailored suit, a deep charcoal that seemed to repel the rain, hugged his frame with precision, and his posture carried the quiet authority of someone who commanded the world around him. This was no ordinary passerby. This was David Hale, a name that reverberated through the city like a thunderclap, a black billionaire whose empire of wealth was matched only by his reputation for generosity. His face, familiar from countless magazine covers and newsreels, was a study in composure, his dark eyes sharp and assessing as he surveyed the street. Granger's mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he knew about Hale. The man had risen from nothing, a self-made titan whose charitable foundations had rebuilt schools, funded hospitals, and lifted entire communities from despair. To some, he was a saint. To others, a puzzle too perfect to trust. Granger didn't buy into the hype. Fame didn't impress him, and wealth didn't sway him. All he cared about was the feeling twisting in his gut, a primal warning that refused to be silenced. Hale adjusted his coat with a casual flick of his wrist, the motion so effortless it seemed rehearsed, and took a step toward the Golden Palace. That was when Granger acted. "Sir," his voice cut through the rain as he shoved open the car door, stepping into the storm without hesitation. Cold water sluiced down his uniform, soaking through the fabric in seconds, but he barely registered it. His boots splashed through a puddle, sending ripples across the sidewalk, and his heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't know why he'd called out. There was no crime, no report, no justification beyond the unshakable certainty that he had to stop this man. Hale paused, turning slowly, his expression a mask of calm tinged with the faintest hint of curiosity. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, deep and unreadable, like pools of ink that swallowed the light. "Yes, officer." Hale's voice was smooth, measured, carrying a faint undertone of amusement that set Granger's nerves on edge. It was the voice of a man accustomed to control, someone who'd faced interruptions before and dismissed them with ease. Granger straightened, squaring his shoulders against the rain. "I'm going to need to see some ID," he said, his tone clipped and firm, laced with an authority he'd honed over years of patrols. The words felt heavy in his mouth, sharper than he'd intended, but he pressed on, driven by that relentless instinct. Hale didn't flinch. For a moment, he simply stood there, the rain drumming against his coat as he studied Granger with an intensity that made the officer's skin prickle. Then, a flicker something crossed Hale's face, a shadow of disbelief, maybe even indignation, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, the words low but clear, laced with a frustration that felt too controlled to be genuine. He reached into his coat, movements deliberate, and Granger's hand twitched toward his belt, fingers brushing the cold metal of his holster. It was reflex, not Riasona habit born from years of facing the unpredictable. Hale produced a slim wallet, flipping it open with the same precision he'd shown stepping out of the car. He handed over his ID, his gaze never leaving Granger's face. The officer took it, his wet fingers smudging the edges of the card as he studied it. David Hale. The name stared back at him, undeniable, legitimate. Everything checked out, yet it didn't. That gnawing unease refused to relent, coiling tighter in Granger's chest. "Reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Just doing my job." Hale exhaled, a sound thick with exasperation, though his composure remained ironclad. "Of course," he replied, his tone dry as he slipped the ID back into his pocket. Without another word, he turned and strode toward the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. Granger stood frozen in the rain, water streaming down his face, the weight of the encounter settling into his bones like lead. What had he just done? He'd followed protocol, hadn't he? So why did it feel like he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross? Inside the Golden Palace, David Hale paused just beyond the threshold, the warmth of the restaurant a stark contrast to the storm outside. His jaw tightened, a rare crack in his polished exterior, as he replayed the moment in his mind. The officer's voice, the demand for it wasn't the first time he'd faced such scrutiny, but it stung all the same. He was no stranger to prejudice, to the assumptions that clung to him despite his wealth and status. But tonight, something shifted. This wasn't just another indignity to shrug off. This was a spark, a quiet fury igniting deep within him. Back on the street, Granger climbed into his cruiser, the soaked fabric of his uniform clinging to his skin. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wheel, doubt creeping into the edges of his resolve. What if he'd been wrong? What if that instinct he'd trusted for so long had betrayed him? The rain pounded harder, a relentless chorus that drowned out the city's hum, and in that moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was only the beginning. He didn't know it yet, but his actions had set off a chain reaction that would unravel a system riddled with flaws, expose the raw nerve of injustice, and force him to confront the man he'd become. For Hale, the encounter was a call to action. From the ashes of that humiliation, he would rise in it as a victim, but as a force, a symbol of resilience determined to dismantle the machinery of bias that had ensnared him. For Granger, it was a reckoning, a collision with the consequences of power unchecked, a mirror held up to his own choices. The city slept on, oblivious to the storm brewing within its walls, a tempest of truth and transformation that would leave no one untouched. Rainwater cascaded off the brim of Officer Granger's hat, trickling in relentless streams down the stiff fabric of his uniform, soaking him through to the bone. He stood motionless on the slick pavement, the cold seeping into his boots, his breath fogging faintly in the dim glow of the streetlights. His mind churned like a storm-tossed sea, waves of doubt crashing against the fragile shore of his resolve. What had just transpired? Why did it feel as though something vital, something he couldn't quite numb, had slipped through his grasp like the rain itself? He had followed protocol to the letter, requested identification, verified the details, maintained the calm authority expected of him. Yet, deep within his chest, a restless ache gnawed at him, whispering that he had overlooked something critical, something that hovered just beyond his reach. He shook his head sharply, droplets flying from his sodden hair, as if the motion could dislodge the unease clinging to his thoughts. There was no time for hesitation. The streets glistened under a fresh sheen of rain, the muted lights casting long, wavering shadows across the asphalt. Out there, beyond this moment, were people who needed him citizens relying on his vigilance. But even as he tried to refocus, that persistent, nagging sensation coiled tighter around his heart. His eyes lingered on the empty patch of pavement where David Hale had stood only moments before. The man's silhouette still etched in Granger's memory like a ghost refusing to fade. A voice pierced the haze of his thoughts, sharp and unexpected. "Excuse me, sir, are you David Hale?" Granger turned, his boots squeaking faintly against the wet ground, and there he was again, Hale, stepping back into the downpour from the shelter of the restaurant's awning. The sight jolted Granger. The man's face, once a mask of cool composure, now carried a tension that tightened the lines around his mouth and eyes. Rain plastered his dark hair against his forehead, but it was the flicker in his gaze, something raw, something unguarded that caught Granger off guard. It wasn't the polished confidence of the successful businessman Granger had clocked him as earlier. No, this was different, a crack in the facade, a hint of something darker that didn't align with the pristine image Hale projected. Had he missed it the first time? Had he been too quick to accept the surface for the truth? "Are you okay, officer?" Hale's voice cut through the drumming rain, steady and measured, yet laced with an undercurrent of something sharper, a subtle defiance that prickled Granger's instincts. Behind him, the restaurant buzzed with life, the faint hum of conversation and clinking glasses spilling out into the night. Servers darted between tables, their laughter mingling with the chatter of well-dressed patrons, oblivious to the drama unfolding just outside. Yet Hale's words sliced through the ambient noise with a precision that set Granger's nerves alight. Why was this man back? There was no logical reason for him to reappear, no justification for standing here again, challenging the officer with that calm, unflinching stare. "I need you to come with me," Granger said, his voice ringing with a sudden, unyielding authority that surprised even himself. The words landed like a gavel, leaving no space for debate, no room for retreat. This wasn't a casual exchange anymore. It had shifted into something heavier, something Granger couldn't yet define. Hale froze, his posture stiffening as though the command had struck him physically. For a fleeting second, his eyes betrayed him a flash of confusion, followed by a glimmer of recognition, as if he'd just pieced together a puzzle Granger hadn't yet seen. It was enough to stop Granger cold, his pulse quickening as adrenaline surged through his veins. Something was wrong. This wasn't routine anymore. "I don't know what you think this is about, officer," Hale replied, his tone disarmingly even, though a faint edge of irritation sharpened his words. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm a regular here every week, same table, same time." His explanation was delivered with the practiced ease of someone used to being believed, someone accustomed to gliding through life unchallenged. But Granger couldn't shake the dissonance. Hale's composure felt too perfect, too rehearsed. Why wasn't he rattled? Most people would fidget, stammer, protest louder under scrutiny, yet here stood Hale, unshaken, his hands steady at his sides, his dark suit pristine despite the rain. Granger's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until the tension was a tangible force, crackling like static in the damp air. "Reports of suspicious activity," he said brusquely, parroting the vague justification he'd leaned on earlier. The words felt flimsy, hollowed out by the doubt creeping into his own mind. Was he still doing his job, or had he veered off course, chasing a hunch he couldn't substantiate? The rain pounded harder now, a relentless curtain that blurred the edges of the world around them, as if the city itself were complicit, holding its breath while the two men faced off. Hale didn't flinch, but Granger caught the subtle tightening of his jaw, the faint flecks of muscle beneath his smooth-shaven skin. This wasn't just a wealthy man caught off guard. This was someone who'd faced interrogation before, someone who knew how to mask fear or guilt or whatever lay beneath that polished exterior. The realization twisted Granger's gut. Power had shifted, and he felt it slipping from his grasp, pooling instead in the steady gaze of the man before him. "You've got the wrong guy, officer," Hale said at last, his voice low but carrying a weight that pressed against Granger's resolve. "I don't know what you're hoping to find, but this isn't it." Granger's fingers twitched at his belt, brushing the cold metal of his badgy, a nervous tick honed by years on the force, a silent testament to the instincts that had kept him alive through countless patrols. Those instincts screamed at him now, a cacophony of warning and uncertainty. Part of him wanted to back off, to let Hale walk away and chalk this up to a misstep. But something deeper, something primal, propelled him forward, overriding reason. "Come with me," he repeated, his voice tinged with a desperation he couldn't mask. He needed to regain control, to pull this spiraling moment back into his orbit. Hale's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind their calm surface, but he didn't resist. Instead, he stepped back, away from the warm glow of the restaurant's entrance. His movements deliberate, almost resigned. Granger advanced, his hand outstretched, rain dripping from his sleeve. "You're making a mistake," Hale said, his tone dropping to a near whisper, sharp enough to cut through the downpour. "I'm being treated like a criminal, and I haven't done a damn thing." The words landed like a blow, precise and piercing, spoken with the quiet fury of a man who'd been unjustly cornered before. Granger faltered, his hand hovering over Hale's arm, struck by the weight of that accusation. What did he know of this man's past? What right did he have to assume guilt where none was proven? And yet, his hand closed around Hale's arm, guiding him firmly away from the restaurant's golden light and toward the stark, unyielding confines of the police cruiser parked a few yards away. Hale didn't pull back, didn't raise his voice. He moved with a chilling precision, each step measured, as if he'd walked this path before and refused to let it break him. That composure unnerved Granger more than any protest could have. A man this steady under pressure wasn't innocent, or if he was, he'd learned to wear innocence like armor. A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the quiet drama unfolding in the rain. A young woman in a red coat paused under her umbrella, her brow furrowing as she watched. An older man with a graying beard lingered near the curb, muttering to his companion as he fumbled for his phone. Granger felt their eyes on him, their judgment seeping into the air, thickening it. His grip on Hale's arm tightened as he steered him toward the cruiser, the rain hammering the roof with a staccato rhythm that drowned out the city's hum. The world seemed to contract, narrowing to this single, fraught moment. "What's this about?" Hale's voice rose now, sharp with frustration, though still tightly controlled. "Why are you doing this?" Granger's stomach twisted, a sickening lurch of doubt. He had no answer, no concrete evidence, just a gut feeling that felt more like a chain dragging him into the unknown. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a chorus of disapproval swelling around them. "Excessive," someone whispered. "Unnecessary," another voice hissed. Phones were raised, their tiny lights flashing like fireflies, capturing every move, every faltering step. Granger's heart pounded, the weight of their scrutiny bearing down on him like a physical force. He reached the cruiser and yanked the door open, the hinges screeching in protest against the wet metal. Hale didn't fight him, didn't lash out. He simply slid into the back seat, his expression a blend of frustration and bewilderment, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Granger slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the night, drawing gasps from the onlookers. The murmurs escalated, words like abuse and overreach floating through the air, each one a needle pricking at his conscience. The flashes intensified, a frenetic burst of light as the moment was immortalized, destined to spread across screens and headlines by morning. Inside the cruiser, Hale sat in silence, his gaze locked on Granger through the rain-streaked window. It wasn't anger in his eyes, nor fear, just a quiet, unyielding defiance that dared Granger to justify this. Granger's chest tightened, a crushing weight settling over him. What had he done? The door's slam still echoed in his ears, a sound that marked a line he couldn't uncross. He'd acted on instinct, on a fleeting suspicion, but now he stood on the precipice of something larger, something that spoke to justice twisted, to power wielded without clarity. The rain continued its relentless assault, the city watching, waiting, as Granger grappled with the consequences of a choice that might haunt him. Long after the storm had passed, the rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the hood of the patrol car where Officer Ryan Granger leaned, his broad shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible burden. He stared out into the gray haze, the world beyond the windshield blurred by water and doubt. Each droplet that struck the glass seemed to echo the turmoil churning inside him, a rhythm of regret he couldn't silence. His mind replayed the last few minutes in agonizing detail, every word, every gesture, every choice that had led to this moment. What had he done, David Hale? A man whose wealth and reputation towered over the city like a monument, now sat handcuffed in the back of his squad car. All it would have taken was a muttered apology, a quick nod, and Hale could have walked away unscathed. Instead, Granger had acted driven by an instinct he couldn't name, and now he wasn't even sure if what he'd done was right. The uncertainty gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. As the rain soaked through the brim of his hat, he pulled the hat lower, a futile shield against the downpour, and stepped away from the car. His boots splashed into the puddles pooling along the curb, the cold water seeping into his socks, a sensation that mirrored the dread sinking into his bones. The walk to the precinct stretched before him, each step heavier than the last, as though the muddy earth itself were pulling him back, whispering that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. His stomach twisted, a sickening knot that had nothing to do with the damp uniform clinging to his skin. It was the weight of a decision he couldn't justify, not to himself, not to anyone. He'd felt something off about Hale, a flicker of unease he couldn't pin down. But that fleeting sensation had spiraled into something irreversible. The moment was gone, and with it, any chance to turn back. Inside the precinct, the air hung thick and oppressive, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. Granger trudged through the dimly lit halls, the murmur of voices drifting from the back office officers shuffling papers, tapping keyboards, their conversations a low hum that barely reached him. No one looked up as he passed. No greetings, no nods, just an eerie, unspoken stillness that pressed against his chest like a vice. Their silence wasn't indifference, it was judgment, cold and deliberate, amplifying the guilt that had already taken root. He reached his desk, a cluttered island in the sea of flickering fluorescent lights, and sank into his chair. His phone buzzed, a sharp vibration that jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. The screen glowed with a message from Clint Allen, a fellow officer and one of the few people in this place he still trusted. "This is going viral." "What did you do?" The words hit like a punch, and Granger dragged a hand across his face, his calloused fingers trembling slightly. The situation had slipped from his grasp, spinning into chaos he couldn't contain. As if summoned by the thought, the precinct door flew open with a force that rattled the frame. Sarah Chen stormed in, her heels striking the linoleum floor with the precision of a metronome. Each click a countdown to confrontation. A senior reporter for the city's news channel, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years chasing stories through the darkest corners of the urban sprawl. Her sharp eyes locked onto Granger, piercing through the haze of his exhaustion, and her voice cut through the air firm, urgent, tinged with an emotion he couldn't decipher. "We need to talk." He flinched at the sound of his first name, Ryan, a rare familiarity that landed like a warning shot. No one called him that unless they were about to dismantle something: his defenses, his excuses, his career. He rose slowly, the chair creaking beneath him, the weight of his actions pressing down until the room felt suffocatingly small. Sarah's presence was commanding, her years of experience etched into the lines of her face, though her gaze now held a frostiness he hadn't seen before. "You've caused a media frenzy," she said. Her tone clipped as she glanced at the phone still clutched in his hand. "We're getting calls from every outlet in the city and beyond. Do you even realize what you've done?" Granger's throat tightened, words evaporating before they could form. He had nothing, no explanation, no justification, just the hollow echo of his own doubt. David Hale wasn't some anonymous figure. He was a billionaire philanthropist, a name synonymous with charity and influence, a man whose every move was watched and celebrated. And now, thanks to Granger, he was a head-linear black billionaire hauled off in cuffs under murky circumstances. His phone buzzed again, a news alert flashing across the screen. "Breaking: David Hale arrested by Officer Granger. Protests expected tonight." The text swam before his eyes, the storm outside roaring louder. But it was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within him. His career dangled by a fraying thread, and deep down, he knew he'd lit the match. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to the shadows of his own mind than to Sarah. "I had to stop him. I felt it's a me thing wasn't right." She didn't blink, her expression unyielding. She wasn't here for his regrets. She was here for the story, and she'd carve it out of him if she had to. "We're airing footage of the arrest," she said, tapping her phone with a manicured nail. "It's already everywhere online. What's happening out there is a circus. People are furious." Granger's gaze drifted to the precinct window, where the rain-slicked glass reflected a growing chaos. A crowd had gathered beyond the station, their silhouettes shifting in the downpour. Some held signs, their ink bleeding in the wet, while others aimed phone cameras like weapons, capturing every moment. Faint chants rose above the wind, a chorus of anger swelling with every passing second. Sarah's voice softened, just for a heartbeat. "Look, Ryan, this could get uglier. You're a cop, you should know better than to act on a hunch." His jaw tightened, the muscles aching from the strain. "I was doing my job." He shot back, the words brittle and defensive. She arched an eyebrow, repeating them slowly, "Doing your job," as if tasting their bitterness. "You're under investigation now, like it or not. The department's already scrambling to handle the backlash. You'd better start thinking about how to salvage this." The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken accusations. His uniform, once a source of pride, now felt like a leaden shroud, pinning him to a reality he couldn't escape. This wasn't just an arrest anymore. It had morphed into a symbol, a lightning rod for rage and scrutiny that stretched from the city's elite to its restless streets. Justice, he'd thought, had guided his hand, but justice was a double-edged blade, and he was the one bleeding. Miles away, in the sleek confines of his office, David Hale sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen glowing in the dim light. The news feeds scrolled endlessly, each headline a fresh wound, his name, his face, his arrest plastered across every platform imaginable. The footage looped on repeat, grainy, chaotic, showing him being shoved against the patrol car, his tailored suit rumpled, his dignity stripped bare. His heart pounded, a steady drumbeat of disbelief and fury. Though his expression remained a mask of calm, he'd known something was wrong the instant Granger's voice had sharpened, the officer's hands closing around his wrists with a force that felt personal, excessive. Now, the world saw it too, and the injustice of it burned in his chest. But anger was a luxury he couldn't indulge in yet. He had to think, to strategize, to wrest control from the chaos threatening to define him. The door swung open, and Charlotte Hayes stepped inside, her heels muted against the plush carpet. His lead attorney, she was a woman of quiet steel, her face taut with worry as she met his gaze. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes carried the weight of the crisis, a storm matching the one outside. "We're preparing a press conference," she said, her voice low but steady, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We need to get ahead of this, David. We can't let them control the narrative." He nodded, the motion deliberate, his mind already racing through the angles. "I know. Let's make sure we have everything in detail. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that's rotten at its core." Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. This wasn't merely a wrongful arrest. It was a glaring spotlight on the prejudice, the bias, the fractures that had festered in their city for generations. "We'll have a statement ready," she added, her tone shifting to one of resolve. "I've reached out to civil rights leaders. They'll stand with you. We'll frame this as a call for justice, starting here, now." David rose, smoothing the creases from his suit with a practiced hand, and turned to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered through the rain, a deceptive beauty masking the unrest below. His voice, when it came, was steady, a quiet thunder ready to roll across millions of ears. This wasn't about one officer's misstep. It was about accountability, about dismantling a power structure that thrived on abuse. Granger's choice had ignited a fire, but David would stoke it into a reckoning. Back at the precinct, Granger stood alone, the echoes of the night closing in. His reflection in the rain-streaked glass, a ghost of the man he'd thought he was. The consequences loomed, vast and unyielding, a lesson in justice he'd never forget. The weight of the day clung to Granger like a damp, suffocating coat as he sat in his dimly lit office, the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across the walls. Every muscle in his body ached, not from physical exertion, but from the relentless burden of what had transpired. The events replayed in his mind, sinking deeper into his chest with every breath, a cold, gnawing sensation that refused to relent. On his desk, the phone buzzed insistently. its screen glowing with yet another message from Clinic Allen. She'd been his partner for nearly a decade, a steady, unflappable presence who always played by the book, or so he'd convinced himself. He stared at the device for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the screen, dread pooling in his gut. Finally, he tapped it open. The words blazed across the display. "What the hell did you do today, Granger?" He let out a heavy sigh, dragging his hands across his face, the stubble scratching against his palms. What could he say? There was no answer that wouldn't sound hollow, no explanation that could untangle the mess he'd made. He set the phone down gently, as if it might shatter under the weight of his guilt, and leaned back in his creaking chair. Outside, the storm raged on, a relentless torrent battering the city. Rain lashed against the grimy windows, each drop a sharp, accusing tap that seemed to echo the chaos in his head. But louder still was the storm within his thoughts, crashing against one another, a cacophony of doubt and regret. Granger had been a cop for over 10 years, a man forged by training and tempered by experience. He'd learned to trust his instincts, to rely on the subtle cues that separated the innocent from the guilty. But that night, something had shifted. Something about David Hale had ignited a spark of unease, a visceral reaction he couldn't rationalize. And now the consequences were spiraling beyond his control. His eyes drifted to the file sprawled across his desk. David Hale's record, pulled earlier that day in a desperate bid for clarity. The pages were crisp, the ink stark against the white paper, detailing a life that seemed impeccable. Hale was no ordinary man. He was a titan of industry, a philanthropist whose name adorned plaques on schools, hospitals, and community centers. Granger flipped through the documents again, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced the lines of text. Millions donated to education. A food bank that had fed Granger's own neighbors during lean times. Hale's generosity was undeniable. On paper, he was a saint, a beacon of hope in a city often shrouded in despair. So why had Granger's blood run cold when he'd faced him? What had he seen in those sharp, unflinching eyes that made his hand itch for his cuffs? The rain streaked down the window in rivulets, mirroring the thoughts slipping through Granger's grasp. He replayed the encounter in his mind, Hale striding into the room, his tailored suit pristine, his posture radiating a quiet, unshakable confidence. It wasn't just wealth, it was the way he moved, the way he seemed to bend the air around him, as if the world existed to serve his will. That arrogance, subtle yet suffocating, had grated against Granger's nerves like sandpaper. But was that enough? Was it fair to judge a man for the way he carried himself? To let personal resentment cloud his duty? Granger's stomach twisted as a realization clawed its way to the surface. This wasn't about Hale, not entirely. It was about him, about the shadows lurking in his own heart, the biases he'd buried beneath years of badges and protocol. He'd acted not out of justice, but out of something uglier, something he couldn't yet name. The phone buzzed again, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. This time, it was his captain. "Get down here now." Granger rose slowly, his legs heavy as if wading through molasses. The precinct stretched before him as he stepped into the hallway, its usual clamor replaced by an eerie stillness. Officers milled about in hushed clusters, their eyes darting toward him, some with pity, others with scorn. He could feel their judgment, a tangible weight pressing against his shoulders as he walked. Word of David Hale's arrest had spread like wildfire, crackling through the station's corridors. And Granger was the fool who'd lit the match. When he reached Captain Ramirez's office, the door creaked open to reveal a man carved from stone. Ramirez sat behind his desk, his broad frame hunched over a stack of papers, his dark eyes glinting with a cold, unyielding fury. "Sit down, Granger," he said, his voice a low growl, clipped and precise. Granger obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from the desk, the worn leather groaning under his weight. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with unspoken accusations. Ramirez finally looked up, his gaze piercing through Granger like a blade. "I've been getting calls all afternoon," he began, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "The mayor's office, the press, internal affairs, and the damn department brass. You've turned this into a circus." Granger shifted uncomfortably, his stomach churning as the captain's words landed like blows. He knew what was coming, could feel the storm building in Ramirez's voice. "You've made a mess of this, Granger," Ramirez continued, leaning forward. His hands clenched into fists atop the desk. "And now I'm the one who has to mop up the blood. What were you thinking? Stopping a man like David Hale? Do you have any idea who he is?" Granger nodded faintly, his throat tight, his mouth dry as ash. He understood now, too late, the gravity of his mistake. Hale wasn't just a wealthy man, it was a symbol, a pillar of the city's aspiration. And Granger had toppled him with nothing but a hunch. "I wasn't thinking clearly, sir," Granger muttered, his voice barely audible. A fragile thread in the tense air. "Clearly not," Ramirez snapped, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to play cowboy because you've got a feeling. This isn't the Wild West. You don't drag a man like Hale into the mud over some gut instinct. You've opened a Pandora's box here. Internal Affairs is already circling, pulling footage from every camera on that street. Hale's lawyers are sharpening their knives, and the press is salivating. You're a liability now, Granger." The words hit like a sledgehammer, each one driving the reality deeper into his core. His career, his reputation, the respect he'd earned over years of serviceit was all crumbling. Reduced to rubble by one reckless choice, Ramirez leaned back, his expression hardening further. "Do you realize what this means? This isn't just about you screwing up. You've exposed the kind of rot we've been fighting to purge from this department. Impulsiveness, abuse of power. How could you be so blind?" Granger had no defense, no words to bridge the chasm he'd created. He sat there, drowning in the captain's disdain, the truth of his actions sinking in like poison. Across the city, in a sleek, modern office perched high above the streets, David Hale sat in stillness, the glow of multiple screens bathing his face in pale light. The news reports flickered relentlessly, grainy footage of his arrest looping on every channel. His name now synonymous with scandal. He watched himself being led away by Granger, his wrists bound, his expression a mask of calm defiance. His team had already mobilized, crafting statements and filing motions. But those logistics felt distant. What consumed him was the violation, the indignity of being reduced to a headline. He'd spent years building something greater than himself, schools for the underserved, hospitals for the sick, yet in an instant, Granger had stripped that away, painting him as a villain. Hale's assistant, a weary young man named Carter, hovered near the door, his fingers nervously tapping against his tablet. "Sir, the lawyers say we can have this thrown out by morning," he offered, his voice tentative. Hale didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the screens. Carter shifted, unsure whether to press further. He'd seen Hale's temper flare before, but this silence was different, deeper, more dangerous. Back at the precinct, Granger wrestled with the wreckage he'd wrought. Justice, he'd always believed, was his guiding star. But now he saw the truth. Power, unchecked, could twist even the noblest intentions into something monstrous. Hale's wealth and status didn't excuse arrogance, but Granger's response had been a mirror, reflecting his own flaws. The lesson burned through him: consequences didn't spare the well-meaning, and the misuse of authority could unravel not just one life, but an entire system. As the rain pounded on, he knew the storm was far from over. The city sprawled beneath David Hale's office window, its streets glistening with the remnants of a fierce storm that had swept through earlier that day. Rainwater pooled in uneven patches along the pavement, reflecting the dim glow of streetlights. But it wasn't the weather that weighed on his mind. His fingers raked through his hair, tugging at the roots as a restless energy churned within him. This wasn't about the chaos of flashing cameras or the endless stream of news articles, dissecting his every move. No, this was something far grander, something that gnawed at his soulless, sprawling tapestry of injustice, woven into the very fabric of the world outside. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and paced toward the window. The skyline stared back at him, indifferent, while the muffled roar of protests grew louder. Rising like a tide against the glass, his chest tightened with a mix of fury and resolve. This wasn't just a personal slight, a single misstep between him and an overzealous officer. This was a symptom of a disease deep, festering wound in the system that had festered far too long. Below, the streets pulsed with life and anger. Crowds swelled outside the precinct, their voices a chaotic symphony of chants and cries, punctuated by the sharp blare of megaphones. Signs bobbed above their heads, scrawled with demands for justice in bold, uneven letters. Some held phones aloft, capturing every moment, feeding the wildfire of outrage that had already consumed social media. David's arrest had become a spark, igniting a fury that refused to be contained. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against him, urging him forward. This wasn't merely about clearing his name or salvaging his reputation. It was about seizing this fractured moment and forging something enduring from it. Change, real, tangible change. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, the city's heartbeat sensing with his own. He wouldn't let this slip through his fingers. Not now, not ever. David Hale had never shied away from the public eye. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to the spotlight's glare, his name etched in headlines for his tireless work, lifting up the city's forgotten corners. Philanthropy had been his shield and sword, a way to give back to a community that had raised him from nothing. He'd sat through countless interviews, shaken hands at glittering galas, and poured his wealth into schools and shelters. But this was a different beast entirely. The rain streaked down the towering windows of his office, blurring the world beyond into a watercolor haze, and his mind raced with a torrent of thoughts he couldn't quiet. Nothing in his life, not the boardroom battles, not the late nights crafting initiative shed, prepared him for the humiliation of cold steel cuffs, biting into his wrists, dragged through the streets like a petty thief, his name smeared across every screen and paper in the city. He'd felt the sting of betrayal from a system he'd spent years trying to mend. Yet, as he stood there, watching the rain carve paths through the grime on the glass, he refused to let it break him. The protests outside swelled, a living testament to the anger he shared. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs, too. Inside the sleek conference room down the hall, Charlotte Hayes moved with the precision of a predator. Her heels struck the polished floor in a staccato rhythm, each step echoing with purpose as she barked orders into her phone. She was David's lead attorney, a woman forged in the fires of courtroom wars. Her sharp mind matched only by her sharper tongue. Papers littered the table before her, legal briefs, statements, strategies hastily assembled in the wake of the disaster that was David's arrest. She paused mid-sentence, her gaze flicking toward him as he entered, her expression a mix of exasperation and steely determination. "David," she said, lowering the phone, her voice cutting through the hum of the room. "We need to move fast. The media's already spinning this into another case of systemic racism. If we don't take the reins now, we'll lose the story entirely." He turned to her, his eyes glinting with a quiet, unyielding fire. "I'm not sitting this out, Charlotte. This isn't just about me anymore, it's about what's been rotting in this city for years. Every person who's been stopped, harassed, treated like less than human because of their skin. I'm done letting it slide." Charlotte studied him, her lips pressing into a thin line. She understood more than most, perhaps. She'd seen the statistics, fought the cases, watched the same patterns unfold time and again. But she also knew the stakes. "I hear you," she said, her tone softening but still edged with caution. "But we've got to be smart about this. This isn't just your arrest, it's a powder keg. We need to lead, not just react. We can't afford to look like victims here." David's hands balled into fists, the tension rippling through his frame. He wanted to storm the precinct, to demand answers with the same force that burned in his gut. But she was Writhe knew it. Emotion alone wouldn't win this war. Strategy would. His reputation, his life's work, the truth itself, all of it hung in the balance. Fragile as a thread stretched too thin. He exhaled, the sound sharp and ragged, and nodded. "Fine. But we're not pulling punches. This is bigger than me, and I'm not letting it die quietly." Across town, Officer Ryan Granger sat slumped in his patrol car, the leather seat creaking beneath him as he gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. The city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like distant stars, but he barely saw it. His mind was a storm of its own, replaying that night in relentless detail. The moment he'd grabbed David Hale's arm, the way the man's calm, steady gaze had pierced through him even as Granger shoved him into the back seat. That look lingered, haunting him, a silent accusation he couldn't shake. He'd walked into that encounter blind, convinced he was upholding the law, doing his job. Now, Now he wasn't so sure. David Hale wasn't just some nobody, it was a man who'd poured his life into the city. A beacon for the people Granger had sworn to protect. And Granger had torn him down, turned him into a headline, a punching bag for a furious public. The radio crackled faintly beside him, but he ignored it. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts from colleagues, warnings from internal affairs, snippets of news alerts branding him the villain. Billionaire philanthropist arrested without cause, one headline screamed. He could hear it echoing in his skull, taunting him. His fist slammed against the steering wheel, the dull thud swallowed by the car's confines. What had he done? He'd followed protocol, so he'd thought. But the weight of his actions pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't just a cop anymore, he was the face of everything people hated about the system. A system he'd believed in, once. Now, as the protests raged beyond his windshield and the department scrambled to save face, Granger felt the threads of his career unraveling, slipping through his fingers like sand. The next morning, David stood at the podium, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters packed the room, their cameras trained on him, pens poised over notebooks, waiting to catch every syllable. He'd rehearsed this, gone over the words with Charlotte until they were etched into his bones. But standing there, the weight of it all hit him anew. His lawyers had pushed for restraint, a polished apology, a condemnation of Granger's actions. Something safe, but David had no patience for safe. This was his moment, not just to defend himself, but to speak for the countless others who'd been silenced. He straightened, his shoulders squared, and cleared his throat. Yesterday, he began, his voice steady and resonant. I was wrongfully detained by Officer Ryan Granger of this city's police department. But this isn't about me alone. This is about a system riddled with abuse, a pattern of discrimination that's crushed too many lives. It's about the men and women who've been branded criminals for no reason, beyond the color of their skin. I won't stand for it any longer. The room hung in silence, the gravity of his words settling over the crowd. A few reporters exchanged glances, others scribbled furiously. David pressed on, his voice rising with conviction. We're at a breaking point. Silence isn't an option anymore. This isn't just my story, it's the story of a community, a city, that's been wrong for too long. We have to hold power accountable. We have to demand better. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, locking onto each face as if to imprint his resolve onto them. This isn't my fight alone, it's ours. Together, we can tear down what's broken and build something just. It's time. The applause erupted, a wave crashing through the stillness, but David barely heard it. His focus was singular, unyielding. Back at the precinct, Granger watched the broadcast from his desk, the grainy screen casting shadows across his pale face. Each word David spoke landed like a blow, stripping away the last of Granger's defenses. He'd expected the storm to pass, for the world to move on. Instead, it had grown, and he was caught in its center. His hands trembled slightly as he shut off the monitor, the silence that followed deafening. Justice, David had said. Accountability. Consequences. Granger hadn't grasped the depth of it until now. Lessened that power, wielded carelessly, could unravel everything. And as the echoes of the press conference faded, he realized he'd been the one to light the match. The air in the city had grown thick with tension, a suffocating weight that seemed to press down harder with each passing day. What had started as a single incident, a fleeting moment of misjudgment, spiraled into something far larger, something unstoppable. David Hale, once just a name on the lips of those who admired his generosity, had transformed into a beacon, a living symbol of a desperate cry for justice and transformation. His face, lined with resolve and shadowed by betrayal, now appeared on every television screen, every protest sign, every whispered conversation in the streets. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a movement. Meanwhile, Granger, a man who had once stood tall with the confidence of someone who believed he upheld the law, felt the ground crumbling beneath him. His chest tightened as he paced the dimly lit hallway outside the captain's office. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of judgmental insects. Each step echoed in his ears, a reminder of how close he was to facing Ramirez again. The last interrogation by Internal Affairs had left him shaken, hours of cold questions. and colder stares, but this time, the air felt different, heavier. It wasn't just suspicion hanging over him now. It was the weight of a trial, unspoken but undeniable. Granger's palms grew slick with sweat as he imagined Ramirez's piercing gaze, those dark eyes that seemed to peel back every layer of his defenses. He wasn't ready for this. He might never be. His phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts, buzzing insistently in his pocket like an angry hornet. He pulled it out with trembling fingers, the screen lighting up with a message from Clinic Allen, his longtime confidant. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This isn't just going to blow over, Granger. You need to face up to what you did. The department's already pulling away from you, leaving you out to dry. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a slow, shuddering breath. Deep down, he'd known this was coming. The truth had been stalking him for weeks, a relentless shadow he couldn't outrun. Before he could even process Clinic's warning, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was Tony, his old partner, the one person who'd stood by him through years of chaos. "We're in this together, man," the message read, "but you've got to fix this." Granger stared at the screen, his heart sinking under the crushing weight of guilt. Tony's loyalty was a lifeline, but it only made the burden feel heavier. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about David Hale, the community, the entire city he'd sworn to protect. The truth loomed before him, stark and unyielding, and there was no escaping its glare. The days that followed blurred into a haze of dread and noise. Granger couldn't step outside without the media descending like vultures, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting his name in accusation. His once proud reputation had been shredded, dragged through the muck of public outrage alongside David Hale's rising star. Every time he dared to glance at his phone, a new headline screamed at him, articles dissecting his every move, opinion pieces branding him with words like racial profiling and police brutality. Those terms clung to him now, as if they were etched into his skin, replacing the badge he'd worn with such pride. But worse than the media's venom was the gnawing emptiness inside him, a hollow ache that flared every time he thought of David Hale. Hale wasn't just some rich guy caught in a bad moment. He was a titan of goodwill, a man who'd turned his wealth into a force for hope. Granger couldn't shake the images that flooded his mind. Hale kneeling in the dirt, with kids at a community center, his laughter ringing out as they built a playground together. Hale gripping the hand of a tearful mother whose child had survived because of his donations. Hale standing tall with teachers, scissors in hand, as they opened a school for kids who'd never had a chance. This was the man Granger had torn down, the man he'd humiliated with a single, reckless choice. The protests erupting across the city only amplified his shame. The streets pulsed with life-angry chants, stomping feet, signs waving high, demanding justice, demanding accountability. Granger felt like a ghost haunting his own life, a symbol of everything broken, everything wrong. In the suffocating stillness of his cramped apartment, Granger slumped over his laptop, the blue glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across his face. His bloodshot eyes flicked from article to article, each one a fresh wound. There it was, in stark black and white, David Hale's legacy of kindness laid bare. The hospitals he'd funded, the schools he'd built, the lives he'd touched. This wasn't just a billionaire. This was a man who'd poured his soul into lifting up the forgotten. Granger's hand trembled as it hovered over the trackpad, scrolling through video after video. There was Hale, sleeves rolled up, grinning as he handed out books to kids with wide, starry eyes. There he was again, cutting a ribbon at a clinic, his voice steady and warm as he spoke of second chances. "God, what have I done?" Granger whispered, his voice cracking in the empty room. The door creaked open and Clinic Allen stepped inside, her presence a jolt to his fractured thoughts. She'd always been a steady anchor in his stormy life, her sharp wit and unshakable resolve a comfort he'd relied on for years. But now, as she stood there in her crisp blazer, her auburn hair pulled back tightly, something felt off. A distance had crept between them, an invisible wall he couldn't breach. She studied him for a long moment, her hazel eyes unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Granger," she said finally, her voice low but laced with an urgency that made his stomach twist. "We need to talk." He couldn't meet her gaze. What could he say? How could he explain the mess he'd made, the lives he'd upended. Clinic had been his rock, the one who'd patched him up after bar fights, who'd shared coffee with him on endless night shifts. Now, her presence felt like a judgment he wasn't ready to face. She took a step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the worn hardwood floor, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "What's going on?" she pressed, her tone firm but tinged with something softer worry, maybe. "The department's cracking under this, Granger. You've seen the news, right?" "I know," he muttered, his voice hoarse as he broke his silence. "I'm the one who started it. This is my mess." Clinic's expression softened, but her guarded stance didn't waver. She crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of his cluttered kitchen counter. "You didn't cause this alone," she said, her words measured. "This isn't just about one bad arrest. It's bigger than that, deeper." Granger let out a bitter laugh, the sound scraping against his throat. "Bigger? How could it be bigger than me taking down the wrong guy? How is this anything but my screw-up?" Clinic paused, her eyes narrowing as she weighed her response. Then her voice sharpened, cutting through his self-pity like a knife. "You think this is just about you, about your mistake. This is about the system. Grangerth one we're both tangled up in. You've been a cop long enough to see it. You know it's rotten." Her words landed like a blow, forcing him to swallow hard against the lump in his throat. He'd always told himself he was one of the good ones, that he could rise above the flaws he'd seen in others. But now the illusion was crumbling. "I was supposed to be better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was supposed to know better." "Nobody's perfect," Clinic replied, her tone gentling, as if she were speaking from a place of hard-earned wisdom. "But you crossed a line you knew was there, and now you've got a choice: keep hiding behind excuses, pretending it was just a fluke, or step up and own it." His pulse raced as her words sank in, each one a hammer striking at the fragile shell of his denial. This wasn't just about one mistake, it was about the man he'd become, the beliefs he'd clung to, the power he'd wielded without question. He'd acted on impulse, on something ugly buried deep inside him. And now the consequences were clawing their way to the surface. "I don't know how to fix this, Clinic," he admitted, his voice trembling with defeat. "I can't undo what I did." She nodded, her expression softening further, but her resolve held firm. "You can't," she agreed, "but you can do what's right now. That's what matters." Across the city, in a sleek office high above the chaos, David Hale sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the wood. The press conference he'd held earlier that day had been a spark, a bold declaration of his fight. But it wasn't enough to quench the fire burning inside him. This wasn't just about clearing his meat, it was about tearing down the machinery that had allowed this to happen. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and let his gaze drift to the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd spent years building something meaningful: schools, hospitals, opportunities for those the world had overlooked. His empire wasn't just wealth, it was a promise, a vow to rewrite the rules for the powerless. And yet, in one night, Granger had turned him into a caricature, a villain in a story he'd never signed up for. The sting of his arrest still lingered, the cold bite of handcuffs, the jeers of officers, the flash of cameras as he was paraded through a crowd. But what cut deeper was the realization that this wasn't an anomaly. It was a thread in a tapestry of injustice he'd spent his life trying to unravel. This was bigger than him, bigger than one cop's bad call. It was about a system that thrived on snap judgments and unchecked power, a system that had crushed countless others before him. David's jaw tightened as he straightened in his chair, resolve hardening in his chest. He wouldn't let this fade into silence. His team was already at work, digging through evidence, grainy security tapes from that fateful night, sworn statements from witnesses, internal police records that reeked of cover-ups. They were building a case, yes, but more than that, they were forging a movement. This was about exposing the rot at the core, about ensuring that power, when abused, would face its reckoning. The door to his office swung open, and Charlotte Hayes stepped inside, her heels clicking with purpose against the polished floor. Her sharp gray suit matched the steel in her eyes, but today, her usual confidence was tempered by a gravity that made David sit up straighter. Charlotte wasn't just his lawyer, she was a force of nature, a woman who'd spent decades fighting for the voiceless, Her dark hair was swept into a tight bun, and the lines on her face told stories of battles won and lost. "David," she said, her voice steady but urgent, "we've got everything we need. Tapes, testimonies, documents, it's all lined up. I've already reached out to civil rights groups. This is ready to move." David met her gaze, a flicker of gratitude warming the edges of his exhaustion. Charlotte wasn't here for glory. She believed in this in him, in the fight they were about to wage. He nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. "Good," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Let's make sure this isn't just my story. Let's make it theirs, too, the ones who've been silenced, the ones who never had a chance to fight back." Back in his apartment, Granger sat frozen, Clinic's words echoing in his mind. The lesson was clear, brutal in its simplicity. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, a tide that swept away those who misused their power. He'd thought he could wield authority without consequence, but now the fallout was everywhere on the streets, in Hale's defiance, in the eyes of the people he'd once served. The system might be broken, but he'd been its willing hand. And as the city roared with demands for change, Granger knew one thing for certain: the consequences of his actions weren't just punishment, they were a mirror, forcing him to see what he'd become. "It seems like your message got cut off, and I'm not entirely sure what you're asking me to do with this narrative. It reads like a gripping story about systemic corruption, accountability, and personal reckoning, centered around characters like Granger, David Hale, and Clinic. If you'd like me to analyze it, expand on it, or assist with something specific like refining the plot, generating dialogue, or even exploring the themes further, just let me know what you're aiming for. For now, I'll assume you might want a continuation or a response to tie up the scene. Here's a natural extension based on what you've provided." Granger shifted uncomfortably in the stiff chair, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Across the table sat two internal affairs officers, their expressions unreadable, though their eyes bore into him like they could see every misstep he'd ever taken. The folder Charlotte had given David, one brimming with damning evidence of systemic bias and corruption, loomed in his mind. He didn't have it in front of him, but he knew its contents were likely mirrored in the files these investigators had. Arrest records, testimonies, patterns that stretched back years. His name wasn't on every page, but it didn't need to be. He'd been part of it, complicit in a machine that chewed people up and spat them out. "Officer Granger," one of the investigators began, her voice clipped and professional, "we've reviewed the incident with David Hale, but this goes beyond that night. We're here to talk about the culture of practice that led to it. You've been with the precinct for over a decade. What can you tell us?" Granger swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of Clinic's words pressing down on him. This isn't just about facing the consequences of one mistake, it's about the system. He thought of David Hale's press conference, the raw passion in his voice as he demanded accountability, not just for himself but for everyone the system had failed. And here Granger was, no longer the enforcer but the one being held to account. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands, still calloused from years of gripping a baton, a gun, a badge. "I didn't see it at first. You're in it so long, you stop questioning. It's just how things are done, how they've always been done. You're told to watch certain streets, certain people. You're told it's about safety, about order. But it's more than that. It's rotten. And I let myself be part of it." The second investigator leaned forward, his pen tapping lightly against the table. "Are you saying you knowingly participated in racial profiling, in corruption?" Granger's jaw tightened. "I'm saying I didn't stop it. I didn't question it. I followed orders, and I made choices I knew were wrong, deep down. Like with Hale, I could have de-escalated. I could have listened. But I didn't, and it wasn't just him. It was 100 little moments before that, building up to this." The room fell silent, the hum of the lights filling the void. The investigators exchanged a glance, but Granger didn't wait for them to press further. He straightened in his seat, meeting their eyes for the first time. "I'll testify. Whatever you need about the precinct, about the patterns, about what I've seen. I'm done hiding from it. If Hale's out there fighting for change, then I'll do my part here. It's not about saving myself. It's about making it right. Meanwhile, across town, David stood at the head of a growing crowd, megaphone in hand. The streets were alive with voiceless activists, community leaders, ordinary people who'd had enough. Charlotte flanked him, her folder of evidence now duplicated and distributed to every major news outlet in the city. The media might have turned against Granger, but David had made it clear this wasn't about one man's downfall. It was about dismantling the structure that propped him up. "We're not here for revenge." David's voice rang out, steady and commanding. "We're here for justice for every person who's been targeted, harassed, or silenced. This ends now. Accountability starts today." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy a tidal wave ready to crash against the old, crumbling walls of the system. David lowered the megaphone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't know what Granger was saying in that interrogation room, but he didn't need to. The fight was bigger than both of them now. It was a reckoning years in the making, and it was only just beginning. "Let me know if you'd like me to tweak this, analyze the characters, or take it in a different direction. What's your next move?" The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as Granger sat waiting. His palms slick with sweat, leaving faint damp marks on the arms of the chair. His heart thudded wildly against his ribcage, each beat a reminder of the storm that was about to break over him. He wasn't just anticipating a routine interrogation about that one chaotic night, was bracing himself for a reckoning that would unravel the very fabric of his identity. For years, he'd worn the badge with pride, believing it stood for something noble, something unshakable. Now, as he sat in the dimly lit office, the flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows across the floor, that belief trembled like a house of cards in a gust of wind. This wasn't about dodging blame or clinging to his career. It was about facing the raw, unfiltered truth of what he'd done and what it meant. The door creaked open, and Granger's breath caught in his throat. Clink stood there, framed in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like a shield. Her face was a blank slate, impossible to read, but her presence hit him like a punch to the gut. She'd been there in the aftermath of that night, one of the first to sit with him as he stammered through his account, his voice shaky and his thoughts a jumbled mess. Back then, she'd been a steady hand, a colleague he could lean on. Now, though, she was something else entirely, a living mirror reflecting every assumption he'd ever made about his job, his purpose, his righteousness. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and in them, he saw the weight of betrayal, not just hers, but the trust of everyone he'd sworn to protect, the camaraderie he'd once cherished, the quiet nods in the precinct hallways, the unspoken bond of the uniform. It all felt like a distant memory now, slipping through his fingers like sand. "Granger," she said, her voice soft but firm as she pulled out a chair and sat across from him. The scrape of the metal legs against the floor echoed in the silence. "They're coming in soon, and they're going to dig deep. You can't sidestep this anymore. No more excuses, no more half-truths. You've got to lay it all out, every single piece of it." Her tone wasn't accusing, but it carried an edge of urgency, a plea wrapped in steel. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table, fingers interlaced as if holding herself together. For a moment, her mask slipped, and he glimpsed the conflict in her, a mix of disappointment, hope, and something like pity. Granger swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight, feeling as though the words he needed were stuck somewhere deep inside. He gave a small, jerky nod, his eyes dropping to the table where faint scratches marred the surface, evidence of countless others who'd sat here before him, facing their own judgments. He knew she was right. This wasn't about salvaging his reputation or dodging the fallout. It was about owning up to the choices he'd made, even if it meant admitting that he'd crossed a line he'd never thought himself capable of crossing. Clink's gaze softened, just for a second, and she added, "You can do this, Granger. It's not going to be pretty, but it's the only way through. Do what's right for once." Before he could respond, the door swung open again, this time with a sharper jolt, and the internal affairs team filed in. 3 figures, each carrying an air of quiet authority, their suits crisp and their expressions unyielding. The lead investigator, a weary man with graying hair and a clipboard tucked under his arm, gave Granger a curt nod as they took their seats. The room seemed to shrink with their presence, the walls pressing in as the weight of their scrutiny settled over him. Granger's mind raced, a torrent of memories and excuses crashing against the dam of his resolve. He wasn't just answering their questions, he was peeling back the layers of a life he'd built, exposing the flaws he'd ignored for too long. As they began, their voices calm but relentless, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system he'd served, the culture he'd upheld, and the people he'd failed. Each question was a chisel, chipping away at the facade, and with every answer, he felt the first faint stirrings of something new, not redemption, not yet, but the possibility of it. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and noise, a relentless assault on Granger's senses. Outside, the city pulsed with fury, its streets alive with the rhythmic chants of protesters and the sharp crackle of megaphones. The arrest of David Hale had ignited a firestorm, and Granger's name was at the center of it, plastered across every news channel, every social media feed, every whispered conversation. He couldn't escape it. His face stared back at him from the flickering TV screen. In his cramped apartment, hollow-eyed and grim, a stranger he barely recognized. The headlines screamed of misconduct, of brutality, of a system rotten at its core. And the footage of that night played on an endless loop, dissected frame by pundits and strangers alike. Some branded him a racist, their words dripping with venom. Others called him a fool, a reckless cog in a broken machine. A few went further, painting him as a menace, a threat to the very community he'd sworn to serve. The accusations piled up like bricks, walling him in, and with every passing hour, the weight grew heavier. At the precinct, the atmosphere was a different kind of suffocating. The once familiar hallways felt foreign now, the air thick with unspoken tension. Officers he'd laughed with over stale coffee, men and women he'd trusted with his life, now turned away as he passed. Their averted gazes stung more than any insult, each one a silent indictment. He could almost hear their thoughts betrayed them, tarnished the badge they all wore, dragged their shared honor through the mud. The break room, once a haven of banter and bad jokes, was a ghost town when he entered. The clatter of lockers and muffled footsteps the only sounds. Granger kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, but the isolation gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. It was a gray, dreary Friday morning when his phone buzzed, the sound jarring in the stillness of his apartment. Captain Ramirez's voice crackled through the line, clipped and heavy with exhaustion. "Granger, you need to come in today. The chief wants a word. It's about the investigation. You know what's at stake." Granger closed his eyes, the phone trembling slightly in his hand as he drew a ragged breath. The dread he'd been carrying for days crystallized into something solid, a cold knot in his chest. This was the moment he'd feared, the one where the consequences would finally take shape. He'd spent years earning the respect of men like Ramirez and Chief Thompson, their approval a quiet source of pride. Now, that respect hung by a thread, and the guilt gnawing. Relentless guilt was a beast he couldn't outrun. He mumbled a reply, barely audible, and ended the call, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, across town, David Hale stood in the shadow of a makeshift stage, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as he watched the crowd gather. The city hummed with tension, a restless energy crackling through the air. But David's resolve was unshakable. The rally he'd organized wasn't just a response to his own arrest, it was a cry for something bigger, a demand for a reckoning that went beyond one man's story. He'd spent days on the phone, his voice hoarse from pleading and planning, pulling together civil rights advocates, fiery community organizers, and soft-spoken faith leaders who'd seen too much suffering in their pews. The media had latched onto him after the press conference, his face a symbol of resistance. But he wasn't content to stop there. This was his chance to turn pain into power, to shine a light on the profiling and brutality that had scarred his community for generations. The rally unfolded in the heart of downtown, where the city's jagged skyline loomed over a sea of faces sighing and old, weary and defiant. United by a shared ache, the crowd stretched across the plaza, spilling into the streets, their signs a forest of cardboard and ink. Justice now, and the violence. Granger must pay. David stood at the front, his broad shoulders squared, his expression a mix of steel and sorrow. He could feel the crowd's frustration, a tangible force pressing against him, and it fueled him. When he lifted the megaphone, his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade, steady and clear. We're here today not just for me, but for every single person this city has failed. The system we're told to trust, it's cracked wide open. It protects some, but it crushes others. And we've been silent too long. The crowd erupted, a roar of agreement rolling through the air, fists pumping and voices rising in a chaotic symphony. David paused, letting their energy wash over him, his chest tightening with the weight of their trust. This isn't about one bad night or one bad cop, he went on, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. This is about a machine that's been grinding people down for years, profiling us, targeting us, treating us like we're less than human. We're done waiting for it to fix itself. We're here to demand justice, to demand accountability, to make sure every voice it's tried to drown out gets heard. The cheers grew louder, a tidal wave of sound, and David's eyes swept over the face mothers clutching photos of lost sons, teenagers with fire in their stares, elders nodding with quiet resolve. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Cameras flashed as reporters jostled for position, their lenses trained on David and the swelling crowd. The rally wasn't just a protest, it was a spark, the birth of something unstoppable. David knew the road ahead would be brutal, lined with resistance and doubt, but he was ready. He'd keep pushing, keep shouting, until the cracks in the system gave way to something better. Back at the precinct, Granger stepped into the captain's office, the worn carpet muffling his footsteps. Chief Thompson sat behind the desk, his weathered face a mask of restraint, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of disappointment. "Take a seat, Granger," he said, his voice low and even, like the calm before a storm. Granger obeyed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the silence stretching taut between them. He knew the footage had been seen, the truth laid bare. Whatever came next, suspension, disgrace, or worse, wouldn't just end his career. It would force him to confront the man he'd become and the system he'd helped uphold. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Justice wasn't just a word on a badge. It was a debt, and he'd spent too long running from the bill. The city streets buzzed with a restless energy, a cacophony of voices rising into the night sky like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. Granger stood in the precinct's dimly lit office, the air thick with tension, feeling the weight of countless eyes unseen, but piercing, boring into him. He'd heard the rumors swirling through the city, tales of outrage and betrayal that had spread faster than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about what he'd done, it was about what his actions had come to mean. The system he'd sworn to uphold, the fragile trust the people had placed in it, teetered on the edge of collapse, and he was the crack running through its foundation. His throat tightened as he faced the chief, a man whose weathered face carried the exhaustion of years spent balancing justice and chaos. Granger's hands fidgeted at his sides, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his uniform, a uniform that once felt like a badge of honor, but now hung on him like a shroud. "I know," he rasped, his voice so faint it barely broke the silence. "I messed up. I let everyone down." The admission clawed its way out of him, raw and jagged, leaving a bitter taste on his tongue. He couldn't meet the chief's gaze, couldn't bear to see the disappointment etched into those steady, searching eyes that hunted for something, anything, to salvage from the wreckage, guilt, regret, a shred of accountability. The chief leaned forward, his chair creaking under the shift of his weight, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "The whole department's under a magnifying glass now, Granger," he said, his tone sharp but measured, cutting through the haze of Granger's shame. "And you're the reason why. You're not just some beat cop anymore, you've become the poster child for everything people hate about us. This isn't just your mess to clean up. It's about whether this entire force can hold onto its soul." The words landed like blows, each one heavier than the last, and Granger felt them settle deep into his bones. He'd seen the signs, protests erupting like wildfires, the news vans circling like vultures, the chants echoing through the streets. He'd known, somewhere in the pit of his stomach, that the storm was coming for him. Now it was here, and he had no shelter left to hide in. With a heavy sigh, the chief sank back into his chair, the lines on his face deepening as if the weight of the city rested on his shoulders alone. "I'm suspending you, effective immediately," he said, his voice softer now but no less final. We'll figure out where you stand once the investigation's done. But don't fool yourself. Granger, this could be the end of the line for you." The words hit Granger like a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from his lungs. He'd spent his whole life chasing this dream, clawing his way up from nothing to wear that badge, to be someone who mattered, who made the world a little safer. And now, because of one reckless, split-second choice, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. "I get it," he murmured, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'll take whatever's coming." The chief nodded, his expression unreadable. "This is bigger than you, bigger than me," he said, his tone carrying a quiet gravity. "But you've got a choice to make now. What kind of man are you going to be? Are you going to duck and run? Or are you going to stand tall and own this for yourself? For the people you've hurt?" Granger rose to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him, as if the ground itself might give way. He didn't have all the answers, shall. He barely had any, but one thing was clear. Running wasn't an option anymore. He had to face the fire he'd ignited, not just for his own sake, but for everyone caught in its blaze. Meanwhile, across town, David Hale stood amid a sea of faces, their voices rising in a unified roar that shook the pavement beneath his feet. The rally had swelled beyond anything he'd dared to hope. Hundreds of people, maybe more, spilling into the streets, their signs held high, their anger and hope woven together in a tapestry of defiance. He'd known this fight wouldn't be easy, but as the days dragged on, the sheer scale of it sank in. This wasn't just about a handful of crooked cops. It was about a machine that had churned along for decades, its gears greased with bias and brutality, so deeply embedded in the city's bones that tearing it down felt like an impossible dream. Yet here they were, shouting into the void, and the void was starting to shout back. David's chest swelled with a fierce pride as he watched the crowd, but beneath it simmered a gnawing unease. The media had latched onto his every word, his call for justice spreading like sparks on dry grass. But with the attention came the backlash, hissed accusations of troublemaker, the veiled threats from those who clung to the old ways. His team, a scrappy crew of volunteers and activists, worked tirelessly in a cramped apartment-turned-war room, their eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, their desks buried under stacks of notes and ringing phones. Reporters demanded quotes, officials pressed for meetings, and the weight of it all pressed down on David like a physical thing. He'd expected the pressure, braced himself for it, but what caught him off guard was how the story had shifted. It wasn't just about his arrest anymore, it was about the rot at the system's core, the fractures that had been there all along, waiting for someone to shine a light on them. Back at the precinct, Granger sat alone at his desk, the suspension notice burning a hole in his pocket. The once bustling room felt like a graveyard now, his colleagues' voices dropping to hushed whispers whenever he passed by. Their eyes slid away from his, their conversations dying mid-sentence as he approached, leaving him stranded in a silence that stung worse than any insult. He'd spent years earning their respect, nights on patrol, cups of coffee shared in the early hours, moments of camaraderie forged in the heat of danger, and now it was gone, shattered by his own hand. The betrayal cut deeper than the isolation, a blade twisting in his gut every time he caught a fleeting glance of pity or scorn. In the days that followed, Granger drifted through a haze of uncertainty, with no paycheck and the investigation looming like a guillotine. He wasn't sure if he'd ever wear the badge again. He spent hours pacing his small apartment, the walls closing in as he replayed the moment that had undone him the night he'd stopped David Hale. It had seemed so simple then, a gut call born of instinct, but now, in the cold light of hindsight, it glared back at him like a neon sign. Why had he done it? What was it about Halia, black man in a nice car, confident and unafraid, that had set off alarm bells in his mind? The more he turned it over, the uglier the truth became. He'd acted on a prejudice he hadn't even known he carried, and the cost was everything he'd built. His phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from his spiral. A text from clinic, a fellow officer who'd always been a steady presence. Even now, we need to talk. Meet me after your shift. Got something big. Granger's pulse quickened. His shift was long gone, but the message stirred a flicker of hopier dread. Was it about the case? Had something shifted? He grabbed his jacket, the fabric heavy with the scent of stale coffee and regret, and headed out into the night. Whatever it was, he couldn't keep dodging the fallout. For David, the next step loomed larger than any before it. An invitation had come from the mayor's office, a private sit-down with the city's top official, a man who'd stayed silent as the streets burned. David stepped into the office, the air thick with the smell of polished wood and power. The city sprawling out below through towering windows. It was a room built to intimidate, a throne for a king who'd ignored his kingdom's cries. But David stood tall, unshaken. Mayor Thompson rose to greet him, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. David shook it, his grip firm but cold, a silent declaration that he wasn't here to play nice. "David, glad you could make it," the mayor said, gesturing to a plush chair. "I've been watching the protests, lot of noise out there. Time we talked solutions." His voice was smooth, practiced, but David didn't sit. He crossed his arms, planting his feet like roots in the earth. "You've been quiet too long," he shot back, his tone steady as steel. "The people are done waiting. They're tired of being hunted in their own streets, tired of a system that sees them as threats for existing. I'm not here to beg for your help, I'm here to demand you do your damn job." The mayor's mask slipped, just for a moment, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. "I get it's a sensitive issue," he said, retreating to the safety of diplomacy. "But the police are under investigation. I can't act without all the facts." David's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the excuse like a blade. "You're not listening. This isn't about one cop or a few mistakes. It's about a machine that's been crushing people like me for years because of our skin, our neighborhoods, and you've let it happen. Justice isn't a favor you grant, it's a debt you owe, and it's past due." The mayor shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under him, but David saw the crack in his armor. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. And beyond these walls, the city watched, waiting to see if power would bend or break. For Granger, for David, for every soul caught in the crossfire. The lesson was searingly clear: abuse power, and the consequences ripple far beyond the moment, tearing at the very fabric of trust and justice until nothing remains but the choice to rebuild her. Be buried by the ruins. The air in the mayor's office felt thick with tension as David stood before him, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. He knew this wasn't going to be a fleeting exchange of pleasantries or a simple negotiation. This was a confrontation rooted in something far deeper than a single arrest. It was a cry for every black person in the city who had been unjustly stopped, harassed, and branded a criminal without cause. David's voice remained steady, though inside a storm of frustration and hope churned relentlessly. "If you genuinely want to mend the wounds tearing this city apart," he said, his eyes locked on the mayor's, "if you truly intend to be part of the solution instead of the problem, then you've got to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people screaming for change." The words hung heavy, each one a plea and a challenge rolled into one. The mayor didn't respond immediately. He leaned back in his leather chair, the faint creak of it slicing through the silence. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished desk. Then he exhaled a long, deliberate breath, and David caught something flickering in his eyes. Was it fear gnawing at the edges of his composure, or perhaps guilt? A shadow of recognition that his hands weren't as clean as he'd once believed. Whatever it was, David felt a surge of certainty. His words had pierced through the mayor's polished exterior. "I'll see what I can do," the mayor finally muttered, his tone flat, almost mechanical. But to David, those words rang hollow, like a reflex spoken out of obligation rather than conviction. He wasn't about to let it slide. "Don't just see what you can do," David snapped, his voice rising with urgency. "Do what's right. We're not blind, we'll be watching every move you make." The warning lingered as he turned and left, the weight of the city's struggles pressing against his back. Later that night, the atmosphere shifted to the quiet hum of a diner, a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed the past week. Granger sat across from Clinic, the worn red vinyl of the booth creaking under him. The place was nearly empty, save for the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen and the murmur of a lone waitress. Chatting with the cook, Granger's hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the edge of a coffee mug that had long gone cold. His mind was a battlefield fair clashed with doubt. and the enormity of the choice ahead loomed like a storm cloud. Leaving the police force, abandoning everything he'd built over years of sweat and sacrifice, felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. Yet staying meant clinging to a system he now saw as fractured beyond repair, a machine that ground down the very people he'd vowed to protect. The thought gnawed at him, each possibility twisting his gut tighter. Clinic watched him from across the table, her expression a mix of sternness and quiet concern. Her dark eyes held no judgment, but they demanded honesty. "You're at a crossroads, Granger," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. "You can keep spinning excuses, pretending what happened was just a slip-oop, a bad call on a bad day. Or you can face it head-on, own what you've done, and take responsibility." She paused, letting her words settle. "This isn't just about that arrest. It's about everything you've let slide your whole career. You've been part of it, propping up the very mess you're now drowning in." Her words landed like a punch, and Granger felt them sink deep, stirring a raw, uncomfortable truth he'd spent years dodging. He nodded slowly, his throat tight. He'd always told himself he was just doing his job, following orders, playing by the rules. But now, those excuses crumbled like ash. He saw it clearly. The system wasn't just flawed, it was rotten, and he'd been a cog in it, turning blindly. Every assumption he'd made, every bias he'd let guide his actions, had fed into a cycle of harm he'd never fully grasped until now. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice trembling, raw with a vulnerability he rarely let show. "I don't know if I can go back to being who I was." Clinic's gaze softened, but her tone stayed resolute. "You don't have to crawl back to that old version of yourself," she said gently. "But you can't stay stuck here either. You've got to move forward, make it right, whatever that takes." Granger leaned back, the booth groaning under his weight. The path ahead was murky, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running from the truth. He had to act, not just for the city, but for the man he still hoped he could become. Meanwhile, David Hale stood tall on the steps of City Hall, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the concrete. A sea of press cameras glinted before him, their lenses trained on his every move. His pulse raced, a steady drumbeat in his chest, but his resolve was a steel rod holding him upright. He'd spent days plotting this moment, turning it over in his mind like a craftsman shaping a blade. This wasn't about him alone, it was about the countless voices that had lifted him here. The families mourning loved ones lost to a merciless system, the individuals targeted and humiliated for no reason but the color of their skin. As he adjusted the microphone, the crowd hushed, and he felt the weight of their expectations settle over him like a mantle. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, his voice ringing out, sharp and unwavering, slicing through the clamor of clicking shutters. "For the past week, I've listened to the stories of those the system has crushed, people it was never built to serve. Families torn apart by loss, citizens marked as threats without cause, their dignity stripped away by a pattern of injustice that stretches back decades. This isn't about one officer's misstep. It's about a history of failure, a broken machine that betrays the very people it claims to shield." The air grew still, his words hovering like a storm ready to break. He scanned the faces before him, reporters scribbling furiously, activists nodding with quiet fire in their eyes, and pressed on. "It's time we stop waiting for change. It's time we demand it. Those who abuse their power must answer for it. This system won't heal itself. It needs to be torn down and rebuilt, brick by brick, starting today." The crowd erupted, a wave of questions crashing toward him, but David raised a hand, silencing them with calm authority. He wasn't finished. "I've spoken to the mayor. I've faced law enforcement. This isn't about promises or good intentions anymore. It's about action. We need a police force that serves, not subjugates. We need to pour resources into the communities we've neglected, to build justice, opportunity, and equity from the ground up. We're done asking politely. We're taking what's ours." Cheers rose like thunder, rolling through the streets. But David didn't linger in the triumph. He stepped back, the echo of his words fading as the work ahead loomed large. For Granger, the days since his suspension had blurred into a haze of restless nights and endless reflection. The arrest of David Hale replayed in his mind, a mistake so glaring it felt like a brand on his soul. Every glance in the mirror showed him a man he barely recognized. Someone who'd failed not just himself but the oath he'd taken. Today, though, was different. He sat in a sterile room at Internal Affairs, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. His palms were slick with sweat, his heart hammering as the team filed in Captain Ramirez at the helm, his face a mask of stern curiosity, flanked by officers whose expressions ranged from cold indifference to faint sympathy. Ramirez broke the silence, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Granger, you've been off the force for a week. We've combed through the evidence. Watch the footage of that arrest. There's no sugarcoating it, you screwed up. But I want it from you. Why did you stop David Hale?" Granger swallowed hard, the question pressing down on him like a physical weight. This was it, no more dodging, no more lies. "I didn't have a reason," he said, his voice low but steady, each word a stone dropping into still water. "I thought I did. I told myself my gut was warning me, that something was off. But I was wrong. I saw a man with influence, with power, and I let my own fears twist that into suspicion. It wasn't about him, it was about me." The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of his confession. Granger pressed on, unable to stop now that the dam had broken. "I acted on bias, on instincts I never questioned. I turned him into a threat when he wasn't, and I've wrecked more than just my reputation. I've lost the trust of the people I swore to protect." He couldn't meet their eyes, couldn't face the judgment he knew was there, but he forced the words out anyway. "I can't erase what I did, but I'll spend every damn day trying to fix it, facing the consequences, owning the mess I've made. It's not enough, but it's all I've got." Ramirez leaned forward, his gaze piercing. For a moment, Granger braced for the worst, but the captain's next words were measured. "I can't say what happens next, but you've laid it bare. That's a start. In that cold room, and on those sunlit steps, a lesson burned bright. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a fire kindled by those brave enough to demand it. Power, unchecked, bred ruin, and the consequences of its abuse rippled far beyond a single act. For David, it was a call to rebuild. For Granger, a reckoning with the man he'd been. The city watched, waiting to see if truth could finally outweigh the lies. In the dim light of a late afternoon, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, David Hale stood before Officer Granger, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet intensity. "I'm not disappointed in you, Granger," he said, his eyes locking onto the officer's, searching for something, perhaps a flicker of understanding, perhaps regret. "What matters to me is that you're owning up to this. That's progress. That's a step you've got to take, and I respect you for it." Granger swallowed hard, his throat tightening as if the words he wanted to say were clawing their way out. He nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched, his mind a storm of guilt and resolve. "I'm ready," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, "to face whatever's coming." There was a rawness in his tone, a man teetering on the edge of reckoning, knowing the path ahead would be unforgiving but necessary. Later that evening, alone in the cramped confines of his office, David sat hunched over his desk, the faint glow of his laptop screen casting shadows across his tired features. The grainy footage of Granger's meeting with Internal Affairs flickered before him, each frame a testament to a moment of truth he'd long awaited. Word had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Granger was suspended. David didn't revel in the news. There was no joy in seeing a man brought low. But he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that stirred within him. This wasn't just punishment, it was the first trembling step toward accountability. Granger had finally looked into the mirror of his own actions, seen the bias that had warped his judgment, and admitted it aloud. To David, that confession, fragile as it was, felt like a small victory in it, a trophy to flaunt, but a crack in the wall of a system that had shielded its flaws for too long. Yet, as he watched the footage loop, David's mind churned with a restless urgency. This was only the beginning. The past week had rattled the very bedrock of law enforcement, exposing rot that ran deeper than one officer's mistakes. Justice, true justice, demanded more than a single fall guy. It required a seismic shift, a dismantling of the machinery that churned out inequity. And that, David knew, would take time, grit, and an unwavering refusal to let the fire die. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of his phone against the wooden desk. He glanced down, his brow furrowing as he read the text from Charlotte Hayes, his sharp-witted attorney. The mayor's office sent over a proposal. They'll talk reform, but only if we ease up on the protests and the noise. They want calm before they act. David's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers hovering over the keys as frustration simmered in his chest. It was the same tired playbook: dangle promises like bait, but only when the spotlight dimmed and the streets grew quiet. He'd seen it before, and it stung just as much now as it always had. With a quick, decisive tap, he fired back. We can't back down now. This is our shot. If we let up, nothing changes. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, the creak of the leather echoing in the stillness. Outside, the city stretched out beneath a bruised sky, its lights flickering like a heartbeat. For the first time in days, a fragile thread of hope wove through his exhaustion. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, but its contours were sharpening. This fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was for every soul the system had failed, every voice it had silenced. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed. It was a prize wrested from clenched fists. The weeks that followed blurred into a relentless whirlwind for both David and Granger, each man grappling with the fallout of their choices in a world that felt irrevocably altered. David threw himself into the fray, a tireless engine driving the reform movement forward. The press swarmed, their cameras flashing like vultures circling a kill. Protests swelled in the streets, a chorus of rage and hope, and public pressure mounted, a tide threatening to drown those who stood in its way. But for every step forward, there was a shove back. Powerful figures, cloaked in authority, scrambling to smother the flames. They craved silence, a return to the comforting hum of the status quo. But David's resolve was ironclad. There would be no peace without justice, no rest until the scales tipped true. The fight had taught him a bitter lesson. Real change was a beast that roared only when cornered, a prize won through blood and sweat, not handed over with a smile. So he pressed on, his voice rising above the din, his vision stretching beyond the chaos to a horizon where laws bent toward fairness and policies shed their old skins. For Granger, the days unfolded in a haze of introspection and isolation. Suspension had stripped him of his badge, his purpose, and left him adrift in a city that marched on without him. He stood at a crossroads, the weight of his actions pressing down like a stone on his chest. At first, he'd bristled at the shame, the whispers that trailed him through the precinct, sharp glances from colleagues he'd once called friends, their eyes heavy with judgment. But as the days wore on, something shifted. Watching from the sidelines, he began to see the cracks he'd once ignored. The system he'd served wasn't just flawed, it was rotten at its core. His arrest of David hadn't been an anomaly. It was a symptom of a disease that festered in the institution he'd sworn to uphold. The public's furry protests clogging the streets, the articles dissecting his every move, the social media posts branding him a villain hammered home a truth he'd spent years dodging. He'd been a cog in a machine that ground down people like David, people who deserved protection, not persecution. That realization didn't lighten his burden, it deepened it, carving lines of regret into his weathered face. One restless evening, Granger sat alone in his sparsely furnished apartment, the hum of the refrigerator a dull companion to his spiraling thoughts. His phone glowed beside him, its screen alive with footage of David's latest rally. The man's voice boomed through the tiny speakers, raw and unyielding, igniting the crowd into a sea of raised fists and fervent cheers. Granger's fingers tightened around the device, his breath catching as he felt the sheer force of David's conviction. Deep down, a spark flared, a quiet, insistent call to stop hiding. Earlier that day, a text from his old partner, Clinic, had cut through the fog. We need to face this together. It won't be easy, but it's right. The words lingered, heavy with meaning. In that solitary moment, clarity snapped into focus. He couldn't leave David and the thousands crying for change to bear this alone. He had to step up, to shoulder his share of the fight, not just for redemption, but for the justice he'd once thought he stood for. Across town, David stood at his office window, his brow furrowed as he gazed out at the city's restless sprawl. The calls for reform had swelled to a deafening roar, but so had the resistencia, wall of inertia from those who clung to power. like drowning men to driftwood. It gnawed at him, the endless push and pull. But what gnawed deeper was the weariness he saw creeping into the faces around him. His alias activists, neighbors, ordinary people with extraordinary hearts were noble. Their cause righteous, but the weeks of shouting, marching, and pleading had left them frayed. The city was tiring, its pulse slowing, and David knew that was the trap the powerful were banking on. If the movement faltered now, if exhaustion won, the moment would slip away, and the old ways would slink back into place. He turned sharply to Charlotte, who sat across the room, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of legal papers. "We need to shift the narrative," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Protests aren't enough anymore. We need something solid, something that forces this into the hands of the people who can actually change it." Charlotte looked up, her brow creasing as she set the documents aside. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone measured but curious. David's eyes burned with a fire she recognized as the same fire that had carried him through every battle thus far, but there was a new edge to it, a calculated daring. "I'm thinking it's time to take this straight to City Hall," he said, "to the mayor, the council, the suits who think they can wait us out. We make them face this not through a press release or a polished speech, but with the people, the ones demanding answers." Charlotte leaned back, her mind racing as she weighed his words. She saw the gamble in it, the risk of escalation, but she saw the brilliance too. "You mean a march to the mayor's office?" she ventured. David nodded, his jaw set. "Exactly. We show them we're not fading away. We bring the community, make them see we are the city. We're not begging for change anymore, we're demanding it." Meanwhile, Granger spent the next few days steeling himself for the inevitable. He'd made his choice, a leave of absence from the force, not as a retreat, but as a reckoning. It wasn't about abandoning his career, it was about facing the man he'd become, and the system he'd propped up. He needed to confront David, not just to apologize for the arrest, but to atone for the years he'd turned a blind eye to the rot. As the day loomed closer, his thoughts churned with memories of who he'd been, a proud officer, a guardian of his community, and who he was now, a man unmoored, forced to rebuild his worth from the ashes. The precinct had already begun to feel foreign, its halls echoing with the murmurs of his disgrace. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, a fragile peace settled over him. Showing up at the protest wouldn't erase his past, but it was a start, a way to prove, to David and to himself, that he was ready to stand on the right side of the fight. The march to City Hall coalesced with a speed that stunned even David. Word spread like wildfire, drawing souls from every corner of the city, activists with megaphones, community leaders with weathered resolve, everyday citizens who'd found their voices in the swell of the cause. They gathered before the imposing stone facade of City Hall, a tide of humanity pulsing with purpose, ready to storm the mayor's office and demand the justice they'd been denied too long. The air crackled with anticipation, a symphony of footsteps and chants rising into the dusk. For David, it was a moment of raw, unshakable clarity. This was the lesson of justice laid bare. Power abused would always breed consequence, and those who wielded it would one day face the reckoning of the wronged. For Granger, standing among the crowd, it was a baptism of sorts, a chance to shed the skin of complicity and step into the light of accountability. Together, they moved forward, to men bound by a shared past, now united in a fight that stretched far beyond themselves. David stood at the forefront of the swelling crowd, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of faces stretching out before him like an endless ocean. Each pair of eyes reflected a shared determination, a collective heartbeat pulsing through the air. This wasn't merely a protest to him, it was a crucible, a moment where the weight of their voices could finally bend the iron will of those perched in power. He felt the electric hum of anticipation ripple through his chest as the march began, the rhythmic thud of footsteps merging with the chants that rose like a storm. Justice wasn't a distant dream anymore. It was a demand, raw and unrelenting, refusing to dissolve into the wind. Amid the sea of moving bodies, a figure caught his eye. Granger, dressed not in the crisp uniform David had once associated with him, but in plain civilian clothes that hung loosely on his frame. He lingered near the crowd's edge, his posture stiff, uncertain, as though he were teetering on the brink of a decision he couldn't unmake. Their gazes locked across the throng, and for a fleeting second, the world hushed, the shouts, the banners snapping in the breeze, the distant wail of a serenal of it melted away. David's breath caught as he searched Granger's face, seeing not just the man he'd known, but the shadow of their tangled past hovering between them. Granger's eyes, usually so guarded, flickered with something vulnerable, perhaps, or a fragile hope. With each hesitant step Granger took toward him, the air grew thick with tension. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat echoing the uncertainty that gnawed at him. What would David say? What could he say? The years of mistrust, the sting of betrayal couldn't be erased with a single gesture. Yet here he was, drawn forward by a pull he couldn't name, his boots scuffing the pavement as the crowd parted slightly around him. When he finally stood before David, the noise roared back to life, but his voice cut through it, steady despite the tremor beneath. "David," he said, loud enough to rise above the chaos, "I'm not here to beg for forgiveness. I don't expect you to wipe the slate clean, but I need you to know I'm standing with you now. I've seen what's real, and I want to make it right." David's eyes narrowed as he studied Granger, the lines of his face hardening with the weight of memory, the silence between them stretched taut, a thread ready to snap. He could feel the crowd's energy pressing against his back, urging him forward. But this moment was his alone to unravel. Granger's words hung there, heavy with intent, and David's mind churned. Could he trust this, after everything the rest's, the cold indifference? The system Granger had once upheld with unwavering loyalty, was this genuine? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head. A gesture so small, yet so profound it shifted the air. "You're here now, Granger," he said, his voice low but firm. "That's what counts." With that, Granger stepped closer, aligning himself beside David as the march surged onward. No more words passed between them, none were needed. Their shoulders brushed as they moved, a quiet pact forged in the heat of the moment. Around them, the crowd swelled with purpose, a living tide rolling toward the mayor's officia, towering edifice of glass and stone, that loomed like a silent judge over the city. To David, it wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of every promise broken, every plea ignored. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred injustice, and only the unified roar of the people could shatter its foundations. Granger, walking at David's side, felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically, but in the core of his being. For weeks, he'd been adrift, a man unmoored by the unraveling of everything he'd once believed. The uniform he'd worn with pride had become a shackle, its weight pressing down on a conscience he could no longer quiet. Now, as the chants reverberated through the streets, he glimpsed something larger than himself, a cause that didn't just demand his presence, but his soul. For the first time, he wasn't an outsider peering in. He was part of the pulse, the fight, the hope. The march reached its crescendo before the mayor's office, the crowd spilling across the plaza like water breaking a dam. The heavy double doors swung open, revealing a cluster of city officials and reporters, their faces a mosaic of curiosity and unease. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, illuminating David and Granger as they stood shoulder to shoulder at the forefront. David's gaze swept the room, locking onto the mayor's ice eyes that darted nervously despite the man's polished suit and practiced smile. The other leaders wore masks of skepticism, their lips pressed into thin lines. But David didn't waver. He'd already won the public's ear. Now, he'd force the powerful to listen. "Today," he began, his voice ringing out with a clarity that silenced the murmurs, "we stand here not as mere protesters, but as the heartbeat of this city. We are the voices of those who've been dismissed, trampled, punished for daring to live in a system built to crush them. We're not asking for change, we're demanding it. Not in some distant future, not after endless debates, but right now." He paused, letting the words settle like stones in still water, each syllable a testament to the years of frustration bubbling beneath. Beside him, Granger stood motionless, his breath shallow as David's words washed over him. He felt exposed, raw, as though the crowd could see every mistake etched into his skin. He wasn't just a bystander anymore, he was a man who'd worn the badge, enforced the rules, and turned a blind eye to the rot within. But standing here, he understood. Redemption wasn't a gift handed down. It was a battle fought step by step. David glanced at him, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, and continued. This man beside me made a mistake. He saw the cracks in the system, owned his part in it, and chose to stand up. That's how he'll be facing our wrongs and fixing them. The city leaders shifted uncomfortably, their glances darting like trapped animals. They couldn't brush this off-net with the cameras rolling, not with the crowd's fervor pressing against the walls. The day wore on, and the pressure tightened like a vice. News vans lined the streets, their reporters scrambling to capture every angle of the peaceful yet unyielding demonstration. By afternoon, the mayor called an emergency session, his voice booming from the podium as he tried to project control. His suit gleamed under the lights, but the sweat beating at his temples betrayed him. I hear your concerns, he said, louder than necessary, and I recognize the anger driving this movement. Change is coming, but it must be deliberate, thoughtful. Deliberate, David's voice sliced through the air, cold and unyielding. He stepped closer to the stage's edge, arms crossed, his stance a wall of defiance. You've deliberated while people suffered. You've weighed their pain against your career, your comfort. We're done with that. We need action real, now, the mayor faltered, his mouth opening and closing as the room held its breath. I'm proposing a task force, he stammered, to review police policies. No, David interrupted, his tone sharp as a blade. We've had enough reports, enough committees. We know the truth. We need reform immediate, concrete. Policing, treatment of minorities, the way this city runs it all changes now. The mayor rocked back on his heels, visibly rattled. Time, he insisted, was needed to overhaul a system so entrenched. But David's retort was swift. We've waited decades. The city's treated its own like outcasts for too long. Time's up. A ripple ran through the crowd, a murmur growing into a roar. This wasn't about one arrest or one officer anymore. It was about a city rotten at its core. A system that thrived on inequity. The people wouldn't stand idle while the powerful clung to their old ways. The mayor's polished words crumbled under the weight of their resolve. And as the meeting dragged on, it was clear he was cornered. Empty promises wouldn't suffice. Action was inevitable. A reckoning for a city fractured by its own leaders' hubris. For Granger, this was only the beginning. The path ahead was jagged, strewn with the debris of his past. But he felt the burden of it all, arrests he'd made, the orders he'd followed, the truth he'd ignored. This wasn't just about standing with David. It was about anchoring himself to a cause that demanded everything. The next morning, he sat at his cluttered desk, the faint hum of the precinct buzzing around him. His fingers trembled as he typed a formal request for a leave of absence. He wasn't abandoning the force not yet, but he needed space to redefine his role, to shift from enforcer to advocate. The system he'd served wasn't just flawed. It was a machine that chewed up lives, and he'd been a cog in it too long. As weeks turned to months, David's relentless push bore fruit. The mayor's office, battered by public outcry and activists like him, unveiled sweeping reforms. Police would face mandatory bias training, body cameras would track every move, and accountability would no longer be a hollow word. The city buzzed with cautious hope, but David and Granger knew the fight was far from over. Justice wasn't a gift, it was a garden, tended by those brave enough to uproot the weeds of power's abuse. Together, they'd planted the seeds, and the harvest, they vowed, would be a city remade. The air buzzed with anticipation as the city took its first shaky steps toward healing. A community oversight board was coming into existence, a bold move designed to ensure the police would no longer operate unchecked. Its formation wasn't just a bureaucratic shuffle, it was a lifeline, a promise carved out of years of mistrust, aimed at holding those with badges accountable for every choice, every action. The weight of this shift hung heavy over the precinct, where whispers of change rustled through the halls like a restless wind. The police chief, a man once seen as untouchable, had stepped down, his resignation a quiet thunderclap that echoed through the city. Controversy had clung to him like a shadow, and his departure left a void quickly filled by a new leader figure who stood before the public, with outstretched hands, vowing to mend the fractured bond between the force and the people it served. This wasn't just a job for the new chief, it was a mission, a fragile bridge he swore to build alongside the community, plank by plank. Weeks later, Granger returned to the precinct. His boots scuffing against the worn linoleum floors he'd once strode with unshakable confidence. He'd been on leave, a self-imposed exile, after the storm of scrutiny had crashed over him. Now, standing in the dim light of the station, he felt the uncertainty of his future like a knot in his chest. His badge still gleamed, but its meaning had shifted. Once, it had been a symbol of authority, a shield he wielded without question. Now, it was a reminder of the damage he'd unwittingly caused in the work he had to do. His heart wasn't light, but it was resolute. He threw himself into the reforms with a quiet ferocity. Attending town hall meetings where voices some angry, some hopeful filled the air with raw emotion. He sat in folding chairs under flickering lights, listening to stories he'd never truly heard before, each one a brick in the wall of trust he was desperate to rebuild. The community engagement programs were new, untested, but he showed up anyway, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes searching the faces of those he'd once policed with a sterner hand. He wanted them to see him, not as the man he'd been, but as the man he was trying to become. Across town, David Hale stood in the golden light of late afternoon, his gaze fixed on the community center rising from the earth like a monument to possibility. He'd poured his foundation's money into it, every dollar a seed planted in soil long left barren. The building wasn't just brick and mortar, it was a beacon, a place where kids could laugh, where families could gather, where the city could breathe again. As he watched workers hammer the final nails and sweep away the last of the construction dust, a slow smile spread across his face. It hadn't been a smooth road. The nights had stretched long, filled with arguments, doubts, and the gnawing fear that it might all crumble before it even began. But now, standing there, he felt a flicker of pride warm his chest. This was real. This was change he could touch. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of Granger beside him. The officer's face was a map of deep lines, etched by thought and resolve. David's voice cut through the hum of the evening, steady and sure. "This is just the beginning," he said, the words carrying the weight of a vow. Granger didn't speak right away. His eyes traced the horizon, where the sun dipped low, painting the city in hues of amber and rose. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "It's a start," he replied, his tone grave but threaded with something solid, something like hope. "And that's enough." The sunset bathed the city in a glow that felt almost sacred, softening the edges of a place that had known too much hardness. David and Granger stood shoulder to shoulder, two men bound by a shared vision, though their paths to it had been wildly different. David, with his wealth and quiet idealism, had always believed in the power of second chances. He'd grown up watching his father wield influence like a hammer, crushing anything that stood in his way, and it had left a mark of determination in David to use power differently, to lift rather than break. Granger, though, had come from the grit of the streets, a kid who'd clawed his way into a uniform because it promised order in a chaotic world. He'd never meant to hurt anyone, not really, but the system he'd served had warped his good intentions into something colder, something that left scars. Now, as they stood together, the city around them hummed with a tentative new rhythm. Kids darted past, their laughter bouncing off the community center's fresh-painted walls. A woman lingered nearby, her arms crossed, watching the two men with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. She'd lived here long enough to know. Promises could dissolve like smoke, but something in their stance made her pause. The oversight board wasn't just a concept anymore. It was taking shape in small, unglamorous ways. Meetings dragged late into the night, with citizens like Mrs. Carter, a weary grandmother with a voice that could cut glass, demanding answers about old cases, old wounds. She'd lost a son to a stray bullet years back, and her grief had hardened into a fierce resolve to see justice done right. At first, Granger had flinched under her gaze. Her words like salt in a wound he hadn't known was still open. But he kept showing up, kept listening, and slowly, she began to nod at him across the room. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a grudging acknowledgement that he was trying. The new police chief, a woman named Elena Voss, brought her own fire to the table. She'd grown up in a neighborhood not unlike this one, her childhood punctuated by the wail of sirens and the weight of distrust. She spoke plainly at those town halls, her dark eyes unflinching, promising not just words but action. She'd already started retraining programs, pulling officers like Granger aside to drill into them the cost of unchecked power. How it eroded not just the community, but the soul of the force itself. Every step forward was small, messy, human. One evening, a group of teen skids who'd once thrown stones at patrol car showed up to the community centers. Opening night, they hovered at the edges, wary, until David walked over. His suit jacket swapped for a worn flannel that made him look less like a benefactor and more like an uncle. He didn't preach, he just handed them sodas and asked about their lives. Granger watched from a distance, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. Later, one of the boys, a lanky kid named Jamal, lingered to shoot hoops on the new court. Granger joined him, the thud of the ball against asphalt a steady beat between them. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't hostile, it was a crack in the wall. A tiny fracture where trust might one day grow. The city wasn't the same anymore. It was shifting, groaning under the weight of its past, but reaching for something better. Justice wasn't just a word he read, was a reckoning. A mirror held up to those who'd abused their power, and a lesson carved into the bones of the place. For Granger, it was personal. Every sit-along glance from a neighbor, every hard-won nod from someone like Mrs. Carter, reminded him that authority unchecked was a poison. For David, it was a legacy. I saw in every brick of that community center a defiance of the corruption his father had embodied, a proof that power could heal instead of wound. As the last light faded from the sky, the two men lingered, the city sprawling out before them like a canvas half-painted. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't finished, but it was alive with possibility, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough.